I already know some people are gonna be mad I'm comparing the 7900 XTX to the 5090 because it's not fair. I can see the comment section now, but let's just stop for 1 second and explain what we're doing here. Basically, this video isn't, oh, shame on AMD for not competing with the 5090 with their last generation flagship. This video is more along the lines of, first of all, answering your curiosity if you were just wondering how these compared, but also maybe somebody bought a last generation AMD flagship product with the 7900 XTX, but the rumor mill slash what AMD has implied themselves are kind of pointing to AMD not having some kind of 5090 competitor, and that their best 9000 series cards might be more along the lines of a 7900 XTX. So it might give you some idea of how those might compare, but more specifically, if you're somebody who bought a 7900 XTX last generation and you upgrade every generation, it's possible that AMD won't have an upgrade for you, at least a meaningful one this generation. So then you might be wondering, should I upgrade to an RTX 5090? That is why we are doing this comparison video, and we are gonna have a massive amount of side-by-sides, some with upscaling, some without, some with frame generation, some without, some with ray tracing, some without. And then there are going to be so many bar graphs. Anyway, that's the plan today. We'll come back to the bar graphs at the end. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty details. I know some of you are gonna hit the chapters at the bottom of the video and just jump right to the bar graphs. I mean, that's certainly something you could do. But what are we looking at here? This is 4K RT Overdrive in Cyberpunk. FSR and DLSS both in their performance modes, but notice that the image quality is very different here. DLSS looks better than FSR, especially when used aggressively. If I pause this at any point, you will notice a lot more detail on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's for a variety of reasons. One thing here is the 5090 is able to use ray reconstruction in addition to just the normal DLSS upscaling, but also they have the new DLSS transformer model, which looks even better than the DLSS CNN model that we've had for a number of years now. And it's still up against the old FSR 3, which is still not AMD's new FSR 4 model, which they've talked a bit about, but we don't have available yet, and we also don't know for sure whether it will end up supporting the 7900 XTX anyway. So let's be clear here that not only is the 5090 offering about triple the performance in path tracing here, but it's also looking better while doing it. Now, that being said, this is a path tracing benchmark. This is not where AMD shines, but that's one reason why we're starting here. If you're wanting to upgrade from a 7900 XTX to an RTX 5090, one of the main places you will see a meaningful improvement is the upscaling and the ray tracing. And for example, look at the fans back here right now. By the way, if you're on a phone, you can pinch to zoom, but like, look at that versus that. Like, there's just massively more detail in this upscale. I think it's pretty apparent both in motion and in the, if I freeze it at any particular point for a side-by-side, look at the palm tree branches, everything like that. Now, Nvidia has also updated their frame generation, so we can take a look at that as well. So if we kick frame generation on top of this, AMD does have FSR 3 frame generation, which we see used on the left-hand side of the screen here. The 5090 is capable of doing a ×2 frame generation mode like AMD, but they're also now capable of doing a ×4 frame generation mode, which again gives you additional motion fluidity, even if it's not making the game more responsive. But let's talk about responsiveness here. While this is pushing the 7900 XTX to about 56 frames per second, you might be like, hey, it's almost 60 FPS. It doesn't feel or look like 60 FPS because you are relying on frame generation to achieve that. It'll still feel more like your sub 30 FPS, whereas the 5090 is frame generating from a much higher base frame rate, so the ×2 mode will feel more like half of 160, which is 80, which feels very good in a single player game. And the ×4 mode will feel more like 1/4 of 280, which again, very, very responsive frame rate, and it looks pretty good. I have a separate video on frame generation. So again, here we are highlighting the improvements you would get in feature set with the 5090. Let's also look at some 1440p results, though, before we move past path tracing. So if we're at 1440p resolution, with quality level upscaling, the 7900 is able to hit 37 FPS. Again, if I freeze frame at any particular moment and you look at the details, look at the bottles behind the counter, look at the bartender's face, look at his chain, things like that, you will notice a lot more detail on the DLSS upscaling here. Again, it's even more improved now with the new transformer model and upgrade to ray reconstruction. So you're getting a better image quality while also delivering about 3 times the frame rate. Notice this is not with frame generation enabled at this point. This is just upscaling. So the 5090 here is able to hit 108 frames per second. In fact, the 5090 doesn't need to use upscaling at 1440p to run path tracing if you just want to be a little over 60 FPS. But again, here we're at 108 FPS using the 5090. So I think we would say the difference here is a high refresh rate grade experience versus a arguably not particularly usable experience. If we go ahead and then kick on frame generation from the 30 FPS range up to 71 FPS is what we're seeing on the 7900 XTX. So even though you see 71 FPS, it'll feel more like half of that. So it's still going to feel a lot more like 35 FPS. And again, the quality of the generated frames will be worse the lower your base frame rate is as well. Plus the differences in the frame generation algorithm. The ×2 frame generation mode from the 5090 puts it at 186 FPS versus the 71 on the 7900, which is about 2.6 times the frame rate. And so it's just a lot faster, you know? Anyway, you could also use the ×4 mode, but yeah, by that point, we're not really comparing apples to apples, but since they have different image quality anyway, none of this is really apples to apples since we're looking at FSR versus DLSS. But again, image quality and frame rate are both better on the DLSS side of the scene. Now, that doesn't mean that all ray tracing games are going to show that much of an advantage for the 5090. In Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, where if you want to play this game, you will be using ray tracing. You cannot turn it off. The 5090 is only ahead by 75%. Now, that's still a large win. It's 126 FPS versus, let me go back for a second though, 71 FPS on the 7900. And notice this is native 4K resolution at the max graphic settings that aren't the full RT path tracing mode. So I do want to highlight here that the 7900 XTX is delivering 71 FPS without upscaling, native 4K here. So the 7900 XTX is absolutely usable at maximum settings at 4K in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, ray tracing included. The 5090, though, is 126 FPS, so it's just certainly doing a lot better. If we drop down to 1440p resolution, still max settings, non-path tracing, though, including RT, the 5090 drops to 48% faster, but there's some signs on GPU utilization that it's being held back a bit by the rest of the system here, and it would have been capable of more, but the fastest 9800X 3D-based system can't keep up. Anyway, now, this game does offer a full RT path tracing mode, but I'm not going to test that here for one reason, because it doesn't let you enable it on AMD GPUs. Let's move on to an Unreal Engine 5 graphical showcase like Silent Hill 2. It's one of the best looking UE5 games, if maybe not the best optimized. And here at maximum settings, which are 4K Epic with the hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on, the 5090 is well over 60 FPS at 66. The 7900 is below 30 at 28. So the 5090 is once again more than doubling the frame rate of the 7900. However, honestly, it's not amazingly high frame rates for either GPU, so you might want to at least use quality level upscaling even on the 5090. If we do that, the 5090 scales up to 91 FPS and the 7900 is at 44. 44 is certainly playable in this slow-paced of a game, and using quality level upscaling at 4K means FSR has less of a disadvantage in image quality compared to DLSS than we saw in the others, plus this is the older DLSS CNN model. However, if I pause on certain things like the hair, I think you can notice that like the hair in motion is a lot more pixelated on the FSR image. It's a lot sharper on the DLSS image. Again, you can pinch to zoom in the YouTube app if you're on mobile here. You can look at foliage. Another place to look is disocclusion, which means if something gets uncovered. So if you look at the very edge of this arm here, things that are being uncovered by the arm are very fizzly on FSR, and we're seeing them less fizzly on DLSS around the edges. Those are some places where even the CNN model of DLSS did tend to have advantages over the FSR model, even where FSR is at its best, which is 4K quality mode. Anyway, so that's what we're seeing here. Now, if we go all the way down to performance mode upscaling, all of those image quality differences that I just highlighted are going to be exaggerated. You'll see even more fizzle around the FSR side of the screen. The hair is even more pixelated and blurry, whereas the DLSS image, performance mode upscaling, still looks pretty solid, even with the CNN model. Not as good as it looked at the quality mode, though. Here, the 5090 is at 114 FPS versus 58 FPS on the 7900. So the 7900 is now pretty close to a 60 FPS experience. Again, just having to deal with the upscaling artifacts in order to get there. If we do 4K epic settings but turn off the hardware accelerated ray tracing, the 7900 is now over 30 FPS instead of under it at native 4K, but it's still only 34 FPS, whereas the 5090 is still more than doubling that at 73. If we go ahead and turn on DLSS quality versus FSR quality, again, same kind of image quality differences I showed before, especially look at like the arms, disocclusion, the hair, things like that. We're now getting the 7900 up to 60 FPS. Looks pretty good, just not as good as the DLSS does. And then we're also at 113 FPS versus 60. So both usable, one's high refresh rate. At 1440p epic settings with ray tracing turned on, no upscaling. Here we're seeing 100 FPS on the 5090, so a nice high refresh rate experience, while only hitting 48 FPS on the 7900. Still pretty usable in this slow pace of a game, though, so I think that this would actually be a somewhat reasonable way to play on the 7900. If we turn on quality level upscaling with DLSS and FSR, again, if I freeze frame, you'll see the same differences in clarity on like the hair, disocclusion artifacts, things like that. We now get the 7900 up to 66 FPS and the 5090s at 127. So almost but not quite doubling the frame rate. Although at this high of a frame rate, we're getting a little bit of system limitations and just engine limitations because UE5 is a stuttery mess on the 5090. So it's possibly held back a little bit in this test as we're pushing to pretty high frame rates. Now, if we move on to 1440p native resolution, epic settings, but without the hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on, we now see the 5090 79% ahead of the 7900 XTX. So we're no longer doubling the performance now that we've turned off ray tracing. It's 122 FPS versus 68 though, so one is still a nice, very high refresh rate experience, and the other one is perfectly playable, just not a super high refresh rate experience. Moving on to another Unreal Engine 5 graphical showcase with Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga at 4K high, and there is nothing above high. That is the highest graphical preset in this game. The 5090 is ahead by 65%. So again, without the ray tracing factored in, we're not seeing as dramatic of wins for the 5090, but it's still pretty significant. 76 FPS versus 46. In this slow pace of a game, I think 46 is perfectly playable. 76 will, of course, feel smoother though. If we move on to quality level upscaling, FSR versus DLSS, once again, you will see similar types of artifacts to what I highlighted in the previous game, so I'm probably going to stop doing the freeze frames. We're seeing 52% faster performance on the 5090 at 111 versus 73. That being said, I think the quality level FSR here looks fine, and 73 FPS is perfectly fluid for this type of game. You're just getting an even better experience in both image quality and frame rate on the 5090. If we move to 1440p max settings, no upscaling, both GPUs deliver a great experience. 77 FPS on the 7900 XTX is perfectly great for this game. Although I am going to mention something here. Without the upscaling at this native stuff, I noticed in my testing that the 5090 doesn't seem to be applying anti-aliasing properly. If you look at some of the details, it's more shimmery. I checked the settings multiple times, restarted the game, and restarted the computer. So I don't know if that's just something weird in the review drivers, although using the same review drivers on other Nvidia GPUs that I've tested didn't show that same weird quirk to the anti-aliasing. Anyway, probably something that'll get sorted out. But I thought I'd just bring that up as just a little side note. Anyway, we are seeing a 49% performance advantage for the 5090 here at 115 versus 77. If we move over to Final Fantasy 16 at 4K Ultra settings, the 7900 XTX is perfectly playable at 50 FPS, but you might be searching for a bit more here. The 5090 is hitting 78, which is a 56% advantage. If we kick on quality level upscaling, again, similar issues if you kind of freeze frame it on the disocclusion artifacts and fuzziness and whatnot. Anyway, 46% performance advantage for the 5090 at 108 versus 74. Both are performing extremely well here, and I do think the FSR quality upscaling at 4K is perfectly usable here. Turning down graphic settings in this game, honestly, I don't really like the way they deal with lowering graphic settings in this game. I think it was designed more around using upscalers on console. Anyway, 1440p Ultra here, we're seeing a 34% advantage for the 5090, but notice the 5090 is not always hitting 99% utilization because we're hitting such high frame rates here with a lot of NPCs in this area, even on a 9800X3D. I think we're seeing at least a little bit of CPU limitation here. Both GPUs performing extremely well, though. Let's move over to God of War Ragnarok at 4K Ultra. We're seeing the 5090 take an 88% lead at 128 versus 68. Yeah, so both are doing a great job, but one's just a much higher refresh rate experience. If we kick on DLSS and FSR quality, similar image quality thoughts to my previous discussions, and the 5090 is 89% faster at 170 versus 90, but 90 FPS is very playable, and honestly, the quality level upscale doesn't look bad or anything, and is perfectly usable here on the 7900 XTX. The 1440p Ultra result is 83% faster for the 5090 at 183 versus 100, but honestly, both GPUs are having a great experience, especially if you're playing this kind of game on a controller or something. 100 FPS is plenty. If we move on to Horizon Forbidden West, we see at 4K very high settings, 57% advantage for the 5090 at 121 versus 77, so both of them delivering an excellent experience here, although again, one is just a much higher refresh rate experience. But notice you don't need to use upscaling in this game, even at a native 4K max settings on the 7900 XTX, and the game looks great. At quality level upscaling, though, the 7900 XTX can hit 98 FPS, and the 5090 scales all the way up to 155, giving it a 58% advantage. And again, similar image quality thoughts to usual. A bit better looking, sharper image, better disocclusion, stability, things like that on DLSS side of things, but doesn't look awful or anything at quality 4K upscaling on the 7900 XTX. 1440p very high settings, native resolution, no upscaling. We are seeing a 46% advantage for the 5090 at 175 versus 120. Again, we're hitting such high refresh rates that right now the 5090 had dipped to like 96% utilization. There's maybe a little bit of a waiting on the rest of the system kind of thing because we're hitting into that kind of refresh rate territory despite being on a 9800X 3D. In Ghost of Tsushima, 4K very high settings, we're at 119 versus 78, so they're both giving an excellent experience at native 4K resolution. 5090 is just 53% faster. If we go to quality level upscaling, they're both well over 100 FPS, but the 5090 is 53% faster at 170 versus 111. If we go to 1440p very high settings, the 5090 is now only 39% faster. Again, if you look at the GPU utilization at times, especially as we get more NPCs on the screen, it's probably a bit waiting on the rest of the system at times with the 5090 because we're hitting such high refresh rate territory. If we go ahead and switch to Call of Duty Black Ops 6, notice that unlike the other games where I was testing at maximum settings, in this one I'm testing at the basic settings because I'm assuming if you're playing a competitive online game, you're going to do what most people do, which is turn down graphic settings to chase high frame rates and to usually declutter the experience so it's a little easier to spot enemies, things like that. Anyway, the 5090 is 32% faster at 204 versus 154. I don't think that's actually a CPU limit here, making the 5090 only 32% faster. It's just that AMD generally overperforms in Call of Duty compared to most other titles. It's just a good result for them here. However, if we move down to 1440p, I do think we're starting to see a little bit more CPU limitation, and actually the benchmarks card at the end of the screen indicates that. And sometimes the GPU utilization is dipping well below 99% if you look at the 5090 screen. So this is somewhat CPU limited. And it's 301 FPS versus 250. So, I mean, it's enough. If you don't get the kill, it's a skill issue, guys. Anyway, let's move on to 1080p. We're now only seeing an 18% advantage for the 5090 because of, again, waiting on the rest of the system. It's almost never fully utilizing the 5090 at this point. So that's the results I have for you. How about we summarize some of it with a big old graph and then switch to some other big old graphs. So what do I overall think? What are the overall results? Well, first of all, let's talk about how much faster is a 5090 than a 7900 XTX. Well, if I just include all of my tests, I'm getting about 77% faster, but you can see that in some tests, like the Cyberpunk RT Overdrive, like it's more than 200% faster. But that's because we're in a path tracing mode. Whereas if you're getting into CPU limited scenarios and things like that, there's less of a differential. So one thing we could do to try to maybe get a more accurate comparison, well, is a couple of things. One option would be to look at just 4K results, and another option would be maybe you bought an AMD GPU because you're just not interested in ray tracing. So let's sort this a few different ways. One option is, what if we just looked at no ray tracing? So if I just remove all of the ray tracing results and keep everything else regardless of resolution, now I'm seeing the 5090 report averaging out to 56% faster. However, I do think that some of the 1440p and 1080p results are a bit CPU limited. So if I just keep 4K results and the quality level 4K upscaling results, because for one, I think that's fairly usable with FSR, even if DLSS does still look better at that point. But also it's keeping a high enough internal resolution that we're less likely to run into CPU limits on the 5090. Now I'm seeing it 64% faster. So again, if we're trying to be just GPU limited, but also throw out the ray tracing results. Now, if you do the opposite of this, and you're like, the whole reason I'm thinking about switching to 5090 is because I do want to try out those ray tracing advantages. Now, if I just show my ray tracing results, I'm seeing an average of 129% faster. But I think it's important to specify the difference here in the results, because notice that Indiana Jones, which is a fairly light ray tracing workload, we're seeing 48 to 75% faster, and the 7900 XTX was hitting great frame rates, although I did mention that I think the 48% faster at 1440p could have been a bit system CPU limited, even on the 9800 X3D. But the point is, there are ray tracing titles that are lighter workloads, and AMD does just fine there. But if you're wanting to do the heavier ray tracing workloads like the full RT modes, Indiana Jones doesn't even let you turn it on a AMD GPU. Cyberpunk lets you turn it on, but the results aren't great. That kind of a situation, then you're certainly getting a much better result on the 5090. But what if I try to answer the question, is it worth upgrading from a 7900 XTX to a 5090? And I think it's important to remember that if we focus on, again, non-ray tracing results, so let me kind of skip past some of those, skip into this kind of stuff. You can see that if you're trying to game at native 4K resolution, the 7900 XTX is not always going to deliver a great experience there. However, usually with quality level upscaling and FSR quality, no, it doesn't look as good as DLSS, but quality at 4K output isn't terrible or anything. you're getting a good experience in the vast majority of games. So I think the 7900 XTX is still extremely usable at 4K. If you turn off heavier ray tracing workloads and maybe use quality level upscaling in the more demanding non-RT games, or just turn down some other settings. The 5090 certainly gets you a better high refresh rate 4K experience. At 1440p, even at native resolution, as long as you're turning off the heaviest of ray tracing workloads, the 7900 XTX is generally giving you a great experience still. And that tends to be the case in pretty much every single game that we tested. Again, at 4K, if you want max settings, maybe kick on quality level upscaling, maybe you wouldn't have to. And at 1440p, you generally don't need any upscaling to have a great experience. So what I'm trying to say here is, do you really need to upgrade your graphics card at all? Because if you have a 7900 XTX, you already have an extremely powerful graphics card. So I would encourage you to, reflect deeply to decide, do you really need to upgrade? Now, if the answer is yes, I really want to upgrade, is the 5090 very much noticeably better than the 7900 XTX? I would say absolutely yes. Has a better upscaler, much higher frame rates even at native resolution, and is much more capable of the heaviest ray tracing workloads, and now has a cool new ×4 frame gen mode on top of all that. So is it worth upgrading from the 7900 XTX to the 5090? Please don't go into debt or something in order to do it. Like, you got a 7900 XTX, it's good, okay? If $2,000 on a new 5090 is nothing to you, you make lots of money and this is your hobby and, it doesn't really matter. Hey, it is a better graphics card, and if AMD's not doing something at this level, maybe you could give, Team Green a shot this time around. That's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I've also got a bunch of other head-to-heads with the 5090 either already published or being published soon, depending on when you watch this video. So I've got like 4090 versus 5090. I'm also working on 3090 versus 5090, 4080 versus 5090. Once the 5080 launches, I'll do that versus the 5090. We'll do all sorts of stuff. So again, feel free to hang around the channel and all that. And anything I publish, sometimes if you're watching this right around launch, I might have some stuff held back as early access for channel members while I give some videos space in the YouTube algorithm. So you can always become a channel member for early access and all that. But again, all the main content will still make it to the main channel in a timely manner to give things space in the algorithm. I hope all of you have an excellent day.